is for my U.S. History 1 students, and what we're going to be looking at for this lecture series is the end of salutary neglect. And what the end of salutary neglect really represents is the beginning of conflict between the colonies and the British Empire from 1763 to 1776. So the overarching essay question discussed the background leading to the and the results of the new British imperial policy after 1763. In the discussion, show how colonial unification was a byproduct of the end of salutary neglect, and give an example of the new policies by discussing either the Grenville Acts of 1764 or the Stamp Act of 1765. So to begin with concept 1, we're just going to look at the end of salutary neglect. So just a little bit of background before we get to concept 1. So understanding salutary neglect comes to an end after 1763, which represents the end of the French-Indian War. And from that, we'll talk more about that later. From the end of 1763, we get numerous laws and taxes passed in this time period, 1763 to 1776. Examples: the Proclamation Line of 1763, the Grenville Acts of 1764, the Quartering Acts 1765, the Stamp Act 1765 as well, Townshend Acts of 1770, and the Coercive Acts of 1773. So these are some of the big laws that were passed at the time that is going to bring the colonies together closer and closer. So it's important to understand during this time period, by 1776, the American Revolution had been completed in every way but the war itself. To give you a quote, this is by John Adams, "But what do we mean by the American Revolution? Do we mean the American War? The Revolution was effected before the war commenced. The Revolution was in the minds and the hearts of the people. This radical change in the principles, opinions, sentiments, and affections of the people was the real American Revolution. The war was fought by the American colonists to keep the rights they had in practice. The only thing the colonists wanted was the right to manage their own affairs within the British Empire. The colonists wanted to maintain the status quo. The English, in point of fact, were the ones that wanted to change it. The colonists did not think in terms of real separation until it became apparent that it was the only way to maintain self-control. So that's real important to understand that for most of the pre-revolutionary periods, 1763 to 1776, a lot of the tension and the conflict that's ensuing is not going in the direction of separating from Great Britain, but it is trying to maintain the status quo of managing their own affairs. It's really not until it's not until 1776 and towards the mid part of 1776 that more and more of the leadership and down to the ordinary colonists began to see that independence was really the only solution. So concept 1, we'll be looking at the background leading to unification of the colonies and why it came into existence. So it's important to understand the original 13 colonies saw each other as very distinct from each other. They would peg their identity not to America, but to Virginia or Delaware or New York or the Carolinas. And so this would pose a real challenge in trying to unify these diverse and disperse different people and societies into one direction, moving towards, one, dealing with the heavy hand of Great Britain, and two, eventually leading towards independence. So Unification came about as a result of the salutary neglect coming to an end in 1763. And as discussed, the period from the early 1600s until the French and Indian War in 1763 is referred to as salutary neglect, right? Because of the results of the Treaty of Paris in 1763, two conditions provided England with the motivation to bring an end to salutary neglect. First, the treaty broke the balance of power in Europe and in the New World and made England the most powerful and prosperous nation in the world, a genuine superpower. Consequently, England now had the time to deal with the colonies. Right? So now that they're a superpower, they're not having to deal with French consistently annoying their vie for further and further colonies and power. They have the time and the focus to get their colonies back in line and put an end to this so-called salutary neglect. Included in her new empire were all of Canada, the eastern Mississippi Valley, parts of India, and other miscellaneous positions. The second part of ending salutary neglect, the French-Indian War, as well as the treaty, also created a financial need for England and resulted in direct change in her American colonial policy. The national debt of England in 1764 was almost 130 million pounds, double what it had been in 1754. And the new acquisitions in two hemispheres greatly increased administrative expenses. As previously mentioned, the annual cost of maintaining the civil and military establishments in America alone had risen from some 70,000 pounds in 1754 to almost 350,000 pounds in 1764. So we're talking almost 3 times or 5 times the amount in less than in nearly just about 10 years. As previously mentioned, the annual costs of the idea of relieving their own tax burdens by taxing the colonists had been thought of before, but it was felt up to this point that it would be unwise. English landowners paying an income tax of 20% felt that the colonists could afford and should start paying some of the tax burden. But the Americans, British Americans, insisted that they were already carrying their full share and contributing directly and indirectly to the maintenance of the imperial government up to the limit of their capacity. The colonies had incurred a debt of over £2.5 million in supporting the war, and an estimated colonial commerce brought in an annual profit of more than $2 million to English merchants. This did not count the port duties collected by English governments on American trade. Right? So they feel like they're already doing enough, and there's also the problem of there's no representation as well. Right? The colonists will just have to abide by these new laws without having a say in increased tax in these supposed increased taxes. Well, that's the background and concept 1 of this lecture series. We'll come back with concept 2, discussing the new British imperial policy. Let me know if you have any questions. I'll talk with you guys later. Oh, you're welcome. Greetings, everybody. Welcome back. We're continuing our lecture series on the end of salutary neglect. And in concept 2, we'll be looking at the end, or we'll be discussing the new British imperial system. So, under this new British imperial system, as a result of the French-Indian War and their focus on their colonies, according to Parliament at the time, they could legally pass or disallow any law they felt was necessary in their colonies. So this is an expression of virtual representation rather than geographical representation. Right? They can govern from afar without any conflict of any kind of enlightened or democratic principles, according to members of Parliament. The problem, though, is poor communication between England and her colonies meant that English control was elastic at best. See, this was before texting and email and the internet and YouTube was available. So this is a huge, it was called, the pond. The Atlantic Ocean is separating them, obviously, so it's going to be pragmatically difficult for the British Empire to implement their authority. The British imperial system lacked effective channels of communication. Information about American attitudes came from royal officials in the colonies and others with special interest to protect or advance, or from colonial agents and merchants in London, whose information was often out of date. Serene in their ignorance, most English leaders insisted that that the colonies were uncouth and generally inferior beings, right? So this attitude of superiority is going to infringe on this relationship when they're trying to implement their authority. Colonial assemblies learned that it was much easier simply to ignore royal instructions instead of trying to fight Parliament's right to make laws. The English and the colonists had never hammered out an agreement on precise extent of English power over the colonies, nor had they argued out their differences openly. Instead, they had fallen into a comfortable pattern of sidestepping serious conflicts. Right, so the basic lack of communication and not dealing with these impending issues. English authorities usually looked the other way when the colonies violated parliamentary regulations or taxes or certain laws. The colonists went on quietly breaking the laws, and they could, without openly challenging Parliament's right to pass them. In 1763, George III appointed George Grenville into the new Chancellor of the Exchequer, basically like a Secretary of Commerce. Grenville discovered that the American Customs Service was costing the English government nearly £8,000 a year in salaries, but was collecting less than £2,000 in duties. Consequently, the English government was losing money on the colonies, even though English businessmen were not. In order to solve this problem, Grenville began his pursuit of the English-American dollar in several ways. First, he put several bills together, including the Sugar Act and the Stamp Acts, before Parliament. These were designed to produce revenue by enforcing duties on American colonists. Second, duties as a tax. Second, in April of 1764, he also got Parliament to pass a measure to tighten up the customs services to enforce mercantilism. Again, the idea of having a self-contained economy where the British Empire would be self-sufficient. This was done by using admiralty courts and writs of assistance. The use of these administrative acts with the Sugar Act passed on the same day are known as the Grenville Acts, and we'll talk more about that in detail in another part of this lecture series. Included in the Grenville Acts was a third measure passed in April of 1764, the Currency Act, which was designed to eliminate colonial currency so it could not be used to pay debts in England. These acts passed after 1763 damaged colonial commercial interests and offended colonial sentiments. After 1763, all conditions for rebellion were at hand except one, a sense of unity among the colonists. We'll keep this part quite short, Concept 2. The next concept we'll be looking at, Concept 3, we'll be discussing and demonstrating colonial unity as it developed under the Grenville regime, and then using the Grenville Acts and the Stamp Act to demonstrate how colonial unity coalesces all the way up to 1776, when they eventually call for independence.